Unit 2. Education of Children with Sensory Impairments in Inclusive Classrooms. Introduction. Dear learners, this unit deals with the developmental characteristics of children with sensory impairments, including developmental deviations of each group, the visually impaired and hearing impairment. You are also dealing with the identification and assessment strategies to be employed by a team of professionals, specifically done by teachers and family. Identification and assessment of educational, social, and environmental barriers will get your attention that assists teachers developing effective learning environments to meet individualized learning preferences of learners in an inclusive classroom. Unit learning outcomes. Upon successful completion of this unit, teacher candidates are able to identify developmental profile of children with sensory impairments, arrange conducive classroom/environment to accommodate learners with sensory impairments in the inclusive settings, improve social and environmental barriers that interfere with education of children with sensory impairments, recognize educational needs, preferences, and motives of learners with sensory impairments in the inclusive classroom. Appreciate diversity in a classroom. 2.1. The developmental characteristics of children with sensory impairments. This subunit deals with developmental characteristics of children with certain forms of impairment, including developmental deviations of each target group. Activity. Did you mind that developmental characteristics of children with sensory impairments are the same all the time? How? What are the environmental forces exerting impact on children with sensory impairments? Is there any developmental difficulty that you may observe on children with hearing impairments? What are the major difficulty areas of children with sensory impairments? Describe the behavioral indications and warning signs of possible hearing impairment observed in the development of a child. What are the cognitive, physical, social and behavioral factors associated with the developmental deviations of children with sensory impairments? When dealing with children with hearing impairment, they are presumed as individuals with different learning styles and abilities. However, they share one common characteristic. Their ability to hear is limited, and this disability may affect cognitive, academic, physical, and communication characteristics. The severity of the hearing loss and the age that the loss occurred determine how well a person will be able to interact with others orally. Students who cannot hear the communications of others will have more difficult time learning through traditional instructional methods. Communication problems can seriously interfere with interpersonal relationships for students with hearing impairments who receive all or part of their education in regular classrooms. Their inability to communicate with other students can delay their language development. Moreover, they communicate in ways that are different from those around them. This condition can inhibit their social interaction and development. The hearing impairment greatest effect on the developing child occurs with regard to language, both with the receptive and expressive systems. Students with hearing impairments lag in vocabulary skills when compared with normal hearing students of comparable age. Problems with synonyms, Syntax and morphology are found to be more prevalent in the hard of hearing children, since the impact of deafness becomes more critical in the second year of life, when hearing children start to talk. The available evidence suggests that the condition of deafness in no way poses no limitation on the cognitive capabilities of individuals. As a group, deaf people function within the normal range of intelligence, and deaf individuals exhibit the same wide variety as the hearing population. But the stigma and discrimination from social activities affect the cognitive development of deaf children. Lack of meaningful language development in the early years may contribute to the low school achievement of deaf students. This is mainly because that early years are critical periods for language learning and cognitive development. Schlesinger and Meadow 1972 suggested that deaf infants are more quiet and slightly more passive. Due to this reality, they may not seek out the environment, and their parents may permit them to rest more quietly without providing them with a variety of stimuli that are necessary for ongoing cognitive development. Recent evidences suggest that those who are deaf prefer to be with others who are deaf, and tend to cluster in groups, socialize and marry. This is because many people who are deaf see the experiences and sign language of deaf communities as the most important factors in their lives. Hence, the obvious barrier to hearing impaired relationships is communication. The developmental effects of visual impairment largely depends upon the interaction of various factors such as degree of impairment, onset of impairment as well as the abilities of children, and the nature of their environment. Not being able to see can in one way or the other have an adverse effect on physical, motor, cognitive, academic, and social and communication characteristics. The visual impairment itself does not retard physical growth and development. In fact, the motor development of the child with a visual impairment during the first few months of life is not markedly different from that of the non-handicapped child. But the age of onset of visual impairment plays an important role in motor development. Lack of vision from birth has a detrimental effect on motor development and delays the acquisition of early motor skills. Some congenitally blind children prefer to lie down in the prone position. Longer periods in the prone position, however, may delay walking. The older the child, when the onset of visual impairment occurs, the more likely he is to have acquired basic psychomotor skills through visual channels, and this may evidence less retardation in motor skill development. Cognition is largely a matter of developing concepts. Since many concepts are learned through visual means, students with visual impairment have difficulty learning some concepts. Think for a minute about the difficulty of learning concepts like orange, circle, bigger, perpendicular, bright, and foggy with limited vision. Here, students who have visual impairments perform poorly in most standard intelligence tests. However, the reason is mainly attributed to the nature of those tests that didn't consider such children. Blind babies tend to be more passive and less inclined to go in search of new experiences. Therefore, severely visually impaired children tend to have few learning experiences in the same time period than the sighted children do. This may slow down their rate of intellectual growth, but not their capacity for it. Hence, Visual impairment places a child at a disadvantage in cognitive development, particularly in the area of sensory stimulation, concept development, and communication. Blindness affects acquisition of social skills, not only because the child cannot see, but also because the person who interacts with the child may not respond in the same way that they respond to sighted children. Many children with visual impairments are rejected by their sighted classmates, possibly because they have not learned what is expected in normal social interactions. For example, youngsters with severe visual impairment tend to lack play skills, ask too many irrelevant questions, and engage in inappropriate acts of affection. Kekolis, 1992. Possibly because of their inappropriate or immature social behavior, they tend to interact with and make friends with the least popular peers in their regular education classes. Here the attitude of parents is more crucial than their child's visual competence. As months of life, they should be cuddled, enjoyed and placed at the center of family activities. Many parents of blind children tend to overprotect them, and that may lead to maladjustment when they grow. It is argued that the effects of hearing loss are pervasive and can create psychological stress. Children who are deaf are often passive participants in communication, as their parents or caregivers tend to deprive them from any type of interpersonal relationships. The more severe the deafness, the greater is the effect on verbal language development. But even mild degrees conductive deafness is thought in some cases to have a significant effect. The result of studies indicated that the performance of deaf students in the areas of reading and writing indicate that they have a great deal of difficulty in processing the language compared with hearing children, where deaf children have notable delays and substantial differences in the development of reading and writing skills. 2.2. Educational identification and assessment of learners with sensory impairments. This section specifically deals with the educational identification and assessment of children with sensory impairments. It mainly focuses on the conditions that chiefly interfere with their academic performances, which may emanate from or entail to personal, social and environmental factors. The assessment areas teachers should follow in identifying the problems, needs and finding possible outlets get your attention. Activity. For what purpose do we employ identification and assessment? What are the basic factors teachers should consider in identification and assessment of needs of learners with disabilities? What major personal, social and environmental factors should you consider in identification and assessment of children with sensory impairments? Explain some of the fundamental assessment tools teachers mostly use in schools. Does educational identification and assessment has relationship with placement and service provision for children with sensory impairments? How? Do you believe that identification and assessment of educational materials have any input in their education? How? There are 3 factors that are important for teachers to understand regarding identifying needs of students with disabilities. Severity of the impairment suggests the extent of involvement of a condition. For students with sensory impairments, severity relates closely to communication ability and experiential background. Students with more severe sensory impairments are likely to use different methods of communication and assistive techniques for mobility. Visibility of a disability brings unwanted attention. Unfortunately, this attention focuses on the perceived negative features of an individual. For many students, this attention causes them to feel devalued. The age at which students acquire a disability has a profound effect on certain skills and abilities, e.g., language acquisition or concept development. Age also affects how students handle their condition and how educational personnel should address the condition. Gearhart and Gearhart 1988, Webster and Wood 1989 mentioned some behavioral indications and warning signs of a possible hearing impairment, which teachers and parents should be alert in their everyday encounters as basic source in identification of children with hearing impairments are inattention, restlessness, distraction of others, more responsiveness in quiet conditions, complaints of earache, full or popping ears, or a visible discharge from the ear, giving inappropriate answers to questions, watching and following what other children do, louder or softer voice than is usual, slowness in responding to simple verbal instructions, with frequent requests for repetition, searching visually to locate a sound source or turning head to the direction sound comes from, needing to sit nearer a sound source than as usual or asking for volume on TV, tape, etc., some irritability or atypical aggressive outbursts, more frequent behavioral upsets in school, reluctances to participate in oral activity, and little interest in following a story, failure to turn immediately when called by name, unless other visible signals are given, tiring easily, poor motivation, listlessness, lack of energy, some stress signs such as nail biting, particularly difficulties in verbally related skills such as reading, phonic work, sound blending and discrimination, and writing with better skills in practical areas, speech limited in vocabulary or structure and use of gesture, best work in small group. Conducting sound assessments is a necessary part of exemplary teaching. Assessments do not only evaluate student learning, but they serve to guide subsequent instruction. However, observations are said to be a key in assessment. Knowing what to look for is critical. Does the child give up easily? Does the child persevere? Is the child able to show how he got the task right? The teacher targets few learning goals per day and few students per day to observe for goal attainment. Formal/informal interviews will help the assessment process. How closely does the individual remain on task? Why or why not? How does the student feel about the activity? What are their thinking processes? Across the nation, most hard of hearing students attend regular education classes, while their deaf counterparts are more likely to attend separate classes, or even separate schools. In recent years, educators, parents and the deaf community have not been able to agree on the placement options that should be available to students who are deaf. It should be stressed that the appropriate teaching environment for teaching the hard of hearing is different from that of the deaf. It is suggested that the conditions of teaching environment for hard of hearing should be more or less similar with that of the hearing pupil. It is always important to remember that placement in regular school less restrictive programs is a function of the degree of hearing loss. Medical advances have helped reduce the incidence and prevalence of severe visual impairments. Medical treatments can also reduce the severity of the visual impairment, especially when it is provided as early as possible. In progressive diseases, treatments such as improving the children's diet or supplementing their diets with vitamins may halt damage before it is too serious. Education, particularly early identification, is a critical element in the prevention of visual impairment, and is especially important when medical technology cannot prevent or reduce the impact of the disability. If children with visual impairments and their families receive professional help early, they all adjust more quickly to the disability, and the child is able to more quickly accustom to the tasks of learning. Limitation from visual observations, a primary method of learning for young children, may be absent for the child with a visual disability. In addition, information acquired by many children through incidental learning through observation may be unavailable to many children with visual disabilities. Some children also develop repetitive stereotypic movements commonly referred to as blindisms such as rocking, eye poking, head rolling, and hand fidgeting. These behaviors are explained as means of compensating the visual stimulation through self-stimulation. 2.2.1 Education of children with hearing impairment in inclusive classes. Like all children who have disabilities, children with hearing impairments need to receive an intensive educational experience as early as possible. Professionals in this field may debate about where education should be delivered, or how much speech and language development should be stressed in the curriculum. Nevertheless, they all agree on 2 points: education should begin at birth, or at the time the hearing impairment was discovered for the individual, and the entire family needs to be involved. Activity. In what conditions do the hard of hearing children learn best? What communication styles best benefit children with sensory neural hearing loss? What are the best curriculum and instructional methods employed in assisting education of the hearing impaired children? Mention some of the instructional processes teachers of the hearing impaired should follow in inclusive classrooms. Deaf pupils are students with impaired hearing who require education by methods suitable for pupils with little or no naturally acquired speech or language. On the other hand, partial hearing pupils are students with impaired hearing whose development of speech and language, even if retarded, is following a normal pattern, and who require for their education special arrangement or hearing aids, though not necessary to use all the educational methods used for deaf pupils. The severity of the hearing loss, the age of its onset, the hearing status of the student's parents are related to the academic success experienced by students with hearing impairments. According to Heward and Delancey 1988, the following characteristics were among those considered most critical to the effective teaching of hearing-impaired students: providing language instruction, developing and adopting instructional materials and enhancing positive self-concept, using information from various assessment procedures, to develop individualized educational programs (IP), and dealing with crises calmly and effectively. In practical instructional process, the teachers for hearing impaired should pay attention to the following 10 tips as described by Seldick and Algazine, 1995. Reduce distance between student and speaker as much as possible. Speak slowly and stress clear articulation. Reduce background noise as much as possible. Sit the student near the center of desk arrangements and away from distracting sounds. Use face-to-face contact as much as possible. Use complete sentences to provide additional context during conversation or instructional presentations. Use visual cues when referring to objects in the classroom and during instructional presentations. Have classmates who take notes during oral presentations for students to transcribe after the lessons. Encouraged independent activities, cooperative learning and social skills. Be sure that the hearing aid functions properly. An effective communication system that permits those using it to exchange information with a high degree of ease, flexibility, speed and accuracy in a wide variety of circumstances is very essential in the process of intervention and rehabilitation process of hearing impaired children. According to Scholes, Carpenter, and Turnbull, 1991, for people with a considerable hearing loss, the basic approach to communication are oral, manual and total communications. Oral method speech communication. Oral languages are transmitted and received through oral and auditory modalities, respectively. The philosophy of oral education is that hearing impaired children should be given the opportunity to learn to speak and understand speech, learn through spoken language in school, and later function as independent adults. Auditory training is meant the maximum utilization of residual hearing. It involves the effective use of hearing aids through the child's waking hours. Training to listen should be given from early childhood to develop natural language and speech. Speech reading is the visual interpretation of spoken communication. Lip reading is unreliable and imprecise. Cued speech is using hand shape and position while speaking. In combination with certain sound, these hand signals make it possible to better distinguish those speech sounds that are easily confused because they look the same on the lip. Sign language is a formal, socially agreed on, rule-governed symbol system that is generative in nature. Con language is a language in its own, with its own linguistic rules and patterns. It is suggested that after deaf students acquire grammatical and communicative proficiency, teachers can use sign language to teach and discuss the content of various academic subjects that are introduced in typical early elementary grades. Con language is a visual gesture language which consists of shape and position of specific body parts such as hands, arms, eyes, face and hand. Cons tend to communicate content words, whereas fingerspelling is useful for functional words such as articles, prepositions. Thus fingerspelling plays a complementary role to signs, when it may significantly increase understanding of the sign language. Total communication is a method of communication for hearing impaired that presents the simultaneous or combined methods of signs, fingerspelling, speech lip reading, speech and auditory amplification at the same time. It also includes gestures, reading, writing and any modal that will result in clarity and ease of communication. 2.2.2 Education children with visual impairment in inclusive classes. Children with visual impairment have problem in their physical growth and development because of environmental factors, particularly the early environment of the home. Parents may be overprotective and fail to provide opportunities to learn. They dispose the infant's and young child's need for many structured opportunities to learn to use his or her body effectively in exploring his/her world. The visual impairment by itself does not have direct effect on physical growth and development. Poor physical strength and coordination is due to lack of motivation to move about and use muscles. Activity. What are the academic needs of students with visual impairments? Do you believe that educational needs of the partially sighted and the blind are the same? Can you mention some classroom modifications needed to assist education of the visually impaired in inclusive settings? What do you suspect the expectation of classroom teacher in the education of children with visual impairments? The academic needs of students with visual impairments require a dual curriculum perspective that consists of the traditional academic content taught to their peers as well as the disability-specific skills for children and adolescents who are blind. The vast majorities of students with visual impairments live at home and attend regular elementary and secondary schools in their local communities. Many receive the same education as classmates who do not share their disability. They may receive extra assistance from resource room teachers and other specialists, particularly in the area of basic skills. Students whose functional use of vision is extremely limited require specialized instruction on additional topics such as orientation and mobility. Teachers of visually impaired children are often thought of in conjunction with specialized equipment and materials such as braille, canes, tape recorders and magnifying devices. Media and materials do play an important role in the education of children with impaired vision. Soldic and Algazine, 1995 listed 10 top hints for teachers of students with visual impairments. Reduce distance between student and speaker as much as possible. Reduce distracting glare and visual distractions as much as possible. Reduce clutter on classroom floor and provide unobstructed access to door and key classroom spaces. Seat students near chalkboard or overhead projections, or give them the freedom to move close to areas of instructions. Avoid partially opening cabinets, storage areas and classroom doors. Ascertain that fully opened or closed doors are safer. Use auditory cues when referring to objects in the classroom and during instructional presentations. When presenting visually dependent material, verbalize written information, describe pictures and narrate non-variable sequences in videotapes or movies. Use complete sentences to provide additional content. Reduce unnecessary noise to help focus content of instructional presentations. Keep instructional materials in the same place so students can find them easily. Make sure glasses and other visual aids are functioning properly. The primary nature of educational programming for the visually impaired involves the modification and adaptation of educational materials. The following are a brief description of the most commonly used materials and equipment. Gerhardt, Weischen, and Gerhardt. 1988. O Braille writer, slate and stylus. O cassette tape recorders may be used to take notes, formulate compositions, listen to record texts, or record assignments. O talking calculator. It is an electronic calculator that presents results visually and auditorily. O closed-circuit television. It is a system that enlarges printed material on a television screen and can be adjusted to either black on white or white on black. The following list of additional visual aids represents the types available from various sources. A. Geography aids, Braille atlases, molded plastic, dissected and undissected relief maps, relief globes, landform model. B. Mathematical aids, abacus, raised clock faces, geometric area and volume aids, right forms for matched planes and volumes, Braille rulers. C. Writing aids, raised line checkbooks, signature guide, long handwriting kit, script letter sheets and boards. To assist all students gain more information, the teacher can use both written and oral forms of communication more precisely. The following suggestions can easily be incorporated into classroom situations. Repeat orally information written on a board. Prepare handouts using enlarged print that summarize the important information presented in lectures. Address students using their names first to get their attention. Audio tape lecture so as students can use tapes as study aids at home. Regardless of those accommodations, teachers should not lower their expectations for students with visual disabilities. These students should be encouraged to be full class members who share their work and thoughts with others in inclusive classrooms. As indicated in King 2008, in the inclusive classroom, we find that students are constantly providing themselves and each other with evaluations of their efforts. Self and peer evaluations evolve naturally from group work and exhibitions, but the skills of such assessments are also taught explicitly to help students monitor, support and sustain their own learning. Students in inclusive classrooms learn to offer suggestions to each other, critique their own and their colleagues' work, and reflect on the processes used to do so. Good and Brophy 1987 cited in Villa and 1995 suggested that the quality of peer instruction/assessment may actually be superior to that of adults for the following reasons. Peers will employ more age-appropriate language. Peers will utilize more relevant and meaningful examples. Peers tend to be more direct than adults. Peers are more familiar with the potential learning frustrations because they have themselves recently mastered what they are to teach or evaluate. We have often found the initial discomfort in marking one's own or colleague's writing is soon replaced by an understanding of expectations and standards in writing, and can result in an improvement in one's ability to organize and write clear prose. As we become more interested in students becoming lifelong learners and learning how to learn, we focus more on individual introspection and reflection, and less on external measures of information acquisition. 2.3 Assessment and elimination of social and environmental barriers to facilitate education of children with sensory impairments in inclusive classrooms. Various environmental forces have impact on children with special needs. These forces include the family, the school and associated treatment programs, and the larger society. Their impact changes as the child develops. The family may be more important in early years, while society is more important in later years. Activity. What are the major environmental factors that affect schooling of the sensory impaired children? How can you try eliminating social and environmental barriers that interfere with the education of children with sensory impairments? Can you mention some benefits of early detection? Mention some advantages of public awareness to education of children with sensory impairments. Can onset of sensory impairment interfere with education of children with sensory impairments? Discuss on the issue. Generally, it appears that the extent to which a hearing impaired child successfully interacts with family members, friends, and people in the community depends largely on the attitudes of others and the child's ability to communicate in some mutually acceptable way. Feelings of depression, withdrawal, and isolation are frequently expressed by hearing impaired persons, particularly those who experience adventitious loss of hearing. Most hearing impaired people are fully capable of developing positive relationships with their hearing peers when a satisfactory method of communication is used. Interventions that deal with the change of parental attitudes contribute to the alleviation of the impact of deafness on a child's social behavior. The greater the hearing impairment, the greater is the degree of relative social isolation, even within the most caring and sympathetic environment. Such relative isolation affects the communication behavior of the hearing impaired child, the education and the remediation. It is reported that the deaf tend to lag behind the hearing in social maturity. It is also reported that the psychological and sociological problems of elementary school-aged hearing-impaired children are not as pronounced as the older hearing-impaired children. It has been argued that hearing loss leads to problems of adjustment in children, because problems of communication produce barriers to social development which are difficult to overcome. In turn, these barriers cause problems in social adjustment and interfere with development of a concept of self. The earlier a hearing impairment is identified, the better are a child's chances for receiving treatment for developing good communication skills, appropriate behaviors, and satisfying social relationships. Parents will usually be deeply shocked on finding their child has a hearing impaired, and they may need to be helped before the latter can be fitted with hearing aids. Parents suffer from a variety of emotions which go through a series of stages from shock and lack of acceptance, to anger, and then eventually to acceptance. Parents of a child with hearing impairment should not be shocked or undergo a process of denial, depression, and detachment if they get support from professionals. Instead, they should be helped to develop mature emotional acceptance of the child. In some cases, the steps needed for prevention are simple. In other cases, complicated medical technology is required. In the following part you will learn how medical technology, Early detection and public awareness can contribute to reducing the number of barriers the individuals with hearing impairments face. Medical technology. Medical technology also plays an important role in the prevention and treatment of hearing problems. Today, most conductive hearing losses that involve the middle ear can be treated either medically or surgically. Early detection. Early detection is a key factor for cases of hearing impairment that can be prevented. Once a hearing problem is identified and diagnosed, medical treatment and educational services can be provided. So, the benefits of early detection are great, but without universal screening of newborn, parents, pediatricians, preschool and daycare educators need to be alert to signs of hearing impairments. These signs include children who do not turn toward a speaker, do not smile when spoken to, do not stop playing to listen to sounds, or do not recognize their mother's voice. The need for early detection, assessment, and intervention is extremely essential on these impairments, which are predominantly found during the early years of human development. Increased public awareness, a more knowledgeable public awareness, availability of good health care for all children, and better prepared preschool teachers can prevent some hearing losses and provide treatment for others. Another way to prevent hearing loss is to make the public aware of the importance of proper immunization. In addition to raising public awareness, we need to make vaccinations available to all children. Wers and Winey 1993 emphasized the role of parents in developing language skills as follows. 1. Parents must communicate and talk to the deaf child as much as possible. The hearing impaired child must be talked to, read to, sung to, and played with just like families do with hearing children, so that the deaf child learns about turn-taking and learns to enjoy communication. 2. The deaf child must be given the opportunity to communicate. He or she needs to practice using different communicative functions just like the hearing child, and will not get this chance if his or her needs are always supplied without him needing to communicate. 3. The deaf child is unlikely to use spoken language as his or her main communicative method, but he or she will use other methods, pointing, gestures, noises. The family must encourage the use of these different methods. Parents need to learn sign language to facilitate their interaction with their hearing impaired child and enhance their psychosocial and cognitive development. Auditory training is meant the maximum utilization of residual hearing. Training to listen should be given from early childhood to develop natural language and speech. It involves the effective use of hearing aids through the child's waking hours. The consistent use of appropriate hearing aids from infancy onwards, and training in the use of residual hearing can influence the child's response to sound. It should be stressed that the appropriate teaching environment for teaching the hard of hearing is different from that of the deaf. It is suggested that the conditions of teaching environment for hard of hearing should be more or less similar with that of the hearing pupil. It is always important to remember that placement in regular school less restrictive programs is a function of the degree of hearing loss. According to Hewitt and Delancey 1988, The following characteristics were among those considered most critical to the effective teaching of hearing-impaired students. 1. Providing language instruction. 2. Teaching small groups of hearing-impaired students who function on different levels. 3. Developing and adopting instructional materials and enhancing positive self-concept. 4. Using information from various assessment procedures to develop individualized educational programs (IP). 5. Dealing with crises calmly and effectively. The developmental effects of visual impairment largely depends upon the interaction of various factors such as degree of impairment, onset of impairment, as well as the abilities of children, and the nature of their environment. Not being able to see can in one way or the other have an adverse effect on physical, motor, cognitive, academic, social and communication characteristics. Blindness affects acquisition of social skills, not only because the child cannot see, but also because the person who interacts with the child may not respond in the same way that they respond to sighted children. Many children with visual impairments are rejected by their sighted classmates, possibly because they have not learned what is expected in normal social interactions, possibly because of their inappropriate or immature social behavior. They tend to interact with and make friends with the least popular peers in their regular education classes. Here, attitude of the parents is more crucial than their child's visual competence. Many parents of blind children tend to overprotect them, and that may lead to maladjustment when they grow. The lack of effective interpersonal social skills can have a lifelong impact. It can influence leisure time activities, success on the job, and overall adjustment. However, with more acceptances of the blind, and partially sighted by the society, the specific adjustment problems can be diminished. Acceptance of the child and denial of reactive are considered positive attitudes because they permit the child to develop and participate. On the other hand, overprotectiveness, open or disguised rejections are negative reactions which interfere with or stunt the child's growth. Attitude of parents are perhaps the most important element in a child's environment. There are some studies available which have resulted in a classification of parental attitudes. Accordingly, a range of potential emotions from anger, despair, guilt, and often to courage have been cited. This results in 5 fairly distinct types of parental attitudes to acceptance of the child with his or her disability, denial of the effects of the disability, overprotectiveness, disguised rejection, and open rejection. Acceptance of the child and denial of reactive are considered positive attitudes because they permit the child to develop and participate. On the other hand, overprotectiveness, open or disguised rejections are negative reactions which interfere with or stunt the child's growth. Parents need to be helped to express, recognize, and eventually modify their attitudes for the mutual benefit of themselves and their children. Therefore, professionals must accept the task of lightening the load of such parents, giving them a chance to be free of guilt, remorse, and resentment. Educators can help parents to find organized family support groups or introduce them to parents who are successfully coping with their child's disability. Among others, the most essential ingredients for the harmonious development of the child with visual impairment include creating loving and accepting family environment, developing positive interaction with child through encouragement of the child to talk and discuss, orienting the child about his or her surrounding through using all possible senses, that is, listening, touching, smelling and even tasting, training the child to move freely from place to place in his or her surrounding, encouraging the child to explore and trust his or her environment, making the child mingle with his or her peers in the neighborhood, playing with the child and providing the child with playing objects of mainly with auditory cues, assuring the safety of the home environment so that the child can freely move and will not be harmed, avoiding overprotectiveness and encouraging the child to develop self-confidence and self-reliance, and maintaining close contact with teachers of the child and seeking advice from professional parents of visually impaired children or from visually impaired adults. Advocates believe that schools have two essential goals for students with disabilities. First, to improve their social competence and acceptance, and second, to change the attitudes and stereotype thinking of teachers and students without disabilities toward individuals with disabilities, who someday will become parents, taxpayers, and service providers. Advocates believe that this can happen only when special needs students are placed in integrated settings. The rationale for educating students with severe disabilities in integrated settings is to ensure their normalized community participation by providing them with instruction and skills essential to their success in the social and work settings in which they will ultimately use these skills. Settings that foster inclusive schools. Teachers' attitudes towards students are a major force in determining the nature of the interaction between teacher and students, and in turn affect students' achievement. Teachers' attitudes also influence the attitudes of students without disabilities towards students with disabilities. Thus, teachers' attitudes should be the first area dealt with as preparations are made to place students with disabilities in regular classrooms. In-service should include a. Getting to know individuals with disabilities, b. Obtaining knowledge about specific disabilities and learning capabilities, c. Identifying the roles of professional team members and planning for the use of available resources, and d. Adapting materials and instructional methodologies to the needs of students with disabilities. Special support personnel. Special support personnel and regular teachers of students with disabilities need to be brought together to study and practice teamwork and the skills of collaboration systematically. Students without disabilities. Research indicates that attitudes towards students with disabilities at both the elementary and secondary school levels are conflicting. However, the bulk of evidence indicates that students without disabilities tend to reject students with disabilities. This may be due to historical practices of segregation, fear of the unknown, and negative attitudes and behaviors displayed by school personnel towards students with disabilities. The importance of good role models with positive attitudes cannot be overstated. Planned interactive activities involving students with disabilities and their peers without disabilities are widely recognized as important factors in successful social integration within the mainstream environment. Preparation of students without disabilities includes increasing their knowledge and information about disabilities such as 1. Understanding the nature of the disabilities, 2. Instructional units on disabilities, 3. Simulation activities, and 4. Structured interaction strategies. Students with disabilities. Teachers can prepare students with disabilities for the transition from the special to the regular classroom by identifying the new situations or environments, listing the activities that will be required in the new environment, specifying the skills needed to function properly, and identifying skills already mastered. 2.4. Planning for effective learning styles to meet individualized learning preferences of learners in the inclusive classroom. The process of developing school policy and procedures on special educational needs is most effective when the process is undertaken in collaboration with the various partners within the school community, trustees, board of management, teachers, parents, and students, and, as appropriate, support agencies and services in the local community. The Department of Education and Science and its agencies have a central role in supporting the inclusive ethos of the school through setting the context for inclusion in national policy and in providing support to individual schools. Activity. Inclusive schooling is characterized by 2 major issues. State both and discuss on their purpose. How could you address challenges of inclusive school settings? What does functional or visual efficiency mean? How can you employ it? What are the basic educational plans needed in assisting children with sensory impairments? What environmental modifications and adaptations are useful in planning for effective education of children with sensory impairments? An inclusive school is characterized by a continuous process of development and self-evaluation with a view to eliminating barriers to the participation of all students in the catchment area. The school's mission statement and the policies and procedures set out in the school plan are pivotal in establishing a positive agenda for inclusion. Schools are advised, therefore, to examine and appropriately revise their culture or ethos, values, mission statement, policies, procedures, management style, organizational arrangements, curriculum content, and approaches to learning and teaching with a view to establishing a school climate, curriculum and instructional approach that are fully inclusive. It is acknowledged that the development and implementation of a coherent whole school approach to the inclusion of students with special educational needs presents a significant challenge for post-primary schools. Certain contextual factors, such as the nature and structure of the syllabus, state examinations, the organization of classes, timetabling, and the conflicting priorities arising can constrain the collaborative planning that is essential for successful teaching and learning. Nevertheless, in spite of the difficulties that may arise, it is critical that such challenges are addressed at whole school level, and those effective structures for planning, cooperation and consultation for inclusion are established. Currently, educators believe that the most important visual consideration is functional visual efficiency, or how well children use their vision, rather than the particular measure of visual acuity. Teachers of visually impaired children are often thought of in conjunction with specialized equipment and materials, such as braille, canes, tape recorders and magnifying devices. Media and materials do play an important role in the education of children with impaired vision. Hence, the primary grown-up of educational programming for the visually impaired involves the modification and adaptation of educational materials. Additional and basic visual aids to be employed by teachers of inclusive classrooms are geography aids, mathematical aids and writing aids. Above all, the following are of paramount importance in avoiding environmental barriers and designing for effective learning atmosphere, in assisting leading independent life. Orientation and mobility training. Orientation and mobility training helps those with severe visual impairments to move around independently. Orientation can be described as the mental map people have about their surroundings. Mobility is the ability to travel safely and efficiently from one place to another. Listening skill training. All students can benefit from improving their listening skills. However, for students with visual impairment, good listening skills are imperative. Many of these individuals must rely heavily on their hearing. Braille training. Students with very severe visual impairments may need to learn to read and writing using different methods. Braille uses a coded system of dots embossed on paper so that individuals can feel a page of text. Enhanced image devices. Many students with vision impairments learn to read using traditional methods with enlarged print. Closed-circuit television systems with a small camera and 200mm lens, overhead projectors, microcomputers, telescopic aids and other specialized equipment are used to enlarge text so that it is easier for people with low vision to read. Audio aids. Audio aids allow persons with visual impairments to hear what others can read. Talking books, talking calculators and devices that compress speech are audio aids that help people with vision impairments to make up for their limited sight. Optical character recognition (OCR) devices. Some students with vision impairments use a computer-based scanning devices that convert printed words into synthetic speech. Recent advances now include small sensors that can be attached to microcomputers to help people who are blind or those with low vision learn from printed text. For those with visual impairments, preschool education is vital. The educational needs of students with low vision differ from those of students who are blind students. Children with low vision might require some extra tutorial assistance to learn the same number of phonetic rules as their classmates, or additional time to read their assignment. Students who are blind might require the inclusion of entirely different curriculum topics. For example, they might need to learn independent life skills so that they can manage an apartment, shop for food, and cook their meals without assistance from others. Below we discuss some methods of teaching and specific curriculum suggestions for students with low vision and those who are blind. Keep in mind, that these two groups are not truly distinct, since suggestions for students with low vision might well apply to many students who are blind. Teaching children with low vision, some minor modification in teaching style can help students with visual impairments gain more from the learning environment. One modification is the careful use of oral language. For example, many of us, when speaking, use words that do not refer to other words' reference. We say this, that, and the without naming the topic we are discussing. Often, teachers write terms on the blackboard without stating them aloud or explaining their meanings. Research has shown that people learn more efficiently when they have been given previews of the lesson about what is to be taught. Unfortunately, few teachers, particularly at middle and secondary schools, provide students with these previews or advance organizers. Advance organizers are especially useful for students with visual impairments. Regardless of those accommodations, teachers should not lower their expectations for students with visual disabilities. These students should be encouraged to be full class members who share their work and thoughts with others. Teaching children who are blind. Many professionals who work with those with visual impairments recommend that teachers use a consistent daily and weekly schedule, so that students will know what is expected at various times of the day and across the week. Also, a teacher can hand out a weekly schedule to help students plan their time and study schedule. Other modifications to the classroom can help students who are blind. Many students with visual impairments need intensive education in addition to the instruction they receive in the regular classroom. Making accommodations participative for students with disabilities in the educational and community activities include the following. 1. Reduced fear of human differences, accompanied by increased comfort and awareness. 2. Growth in social cognition. 3. Improvements in self-concept. 4. Development of personal principles. 5. Warm and caring friendships. Keys to successful inclusive classroom include: students need to be active, not passive learners. Children should be encouraged to make choices as often as possible. A good teacher will allow students some time to struggle, as some of the most powerful learning stems from taking risks and learning from mistakes. Parental involvement is crucial. Students with disabilities must be free to learn at their own pace and have accommodations and alternative assessment strategies in place to meet their unique needs. Students need to experience success. Learning goals need to be specific, attainable, and measurable, and have some challenge to them. King 2008 in his book The Benefits of an Inclusive Classroom states, what the role of a teacher looks like, classroom situation behavior, what assessment in inclusive setting looks like, and a good inclusive classroom planners target goals of inclusion in the following paragraphs. The teacher facilitates learning by encouraging, prompting, interacting, and probing with good questioning techniques, such as how do you know it is right? Can you show me how? The teacher provides 3-4 activities that address the multiple learning styles and enables students make choices. For instance, in a spelling activity, a student may choose to cut and paste the letters from newspapers or use magnetic letters to manipulate the words or use colored shaving cream to print the words. The teacher will have many conferences with students. The teacher will provide many learning manipulatives and opportunities for small group learning. Parent volunteers are helping with counting, reading, assisting with unfinished tasks, journals, reviewing basic concepts such as math facts and sight words. The classroom is a beehive of activity. Students should be engaged in problem-solving activities. John Dewey once said, "The only time we think is when we are given a problem." The classroom that is child-centered is based on learning centers. There will be a language center with learning goals, perhaps a media center with opportunity to listen to taped stories, or create a multimedia presentation on the computer. There will be a music center and a math center with many manipulatives. The goals are always clearly stated prior to students engaging in learning activities. The teacher will ask students for reminders about the acceptable noise level, learning goals, and what completed tasks look like. The teacher again facilitates the learning throughout the center and focuses on some specific center. Activities at the center take into consideration multiple intelligences and learning styles. The learning course begin with whole class instructions and end with whole class discussions on the learning that took place. Schools are also advised to provide parents with regular reports on the progress of their child. A homeschool notebook for weekly or daily homeschool communication has to be used successfully in all schools. Face-to-face communication has to be facilitated through the regular parent-teacher meetings. Schools are advised to be open to arranging additional meetings as necessary, or at the request of parents. Special arrangements may need to be made with the parents in relation to the homework that each individual student with special educational needs is expected to undertake. Parents also help the school by keeping the teachers informed of the progress or the difficulties they observe in their child's learning as they progress through the various stages of post-primary and secondary schools. Parents also assist their child by showing an interest in their schoolwork and by arranging an appropriate place at home for them in which to do homework. By familiarizing themselves with the approaches taken in school, parents provide more effective support for their children at home and can assist them in the practice and reinforcement of new skills. In referring to the education plan for an individual student with special educational needs, the National Council for Special Education (CSE) guidelines use the internationally accepted term Individual Education Plan. This term and the abbreviation IP are used also in this document. 6 steps are identified in the CSE guidelines in relation to drawing up, implementing and reviewing an IP, as provided for in the Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs Act of Ireland 2004, cited in Martin 2007. These steps are: Step 1. Gathering information. Step 2. Statement of level of performance including strengths, needs and impact on learning. Step 3. Identification of priority learning needs and time frame for attainment of targets. Step 4. Setting targets for each priority learning need. Step 5. Identification of the strategies and resources required. Step 6. Setting date for review of IEP. The IEP should include a description of the special education and related support services that are required. The learning strategies that the student will use to address his or her targets should be specified also. In deciding on learning strategies, the student's learning strengths and interests as well as his or her priority needs should be considered. The identification of the strategies and resources that are required involves collaboration and cooperation between the resource teacher, mainstream teachers and teachers who have specific responsibility for areas such as learning support, guidance and counseling, pastoral care and curriculum. The teacher with responsibility for the coordination of the IEP should communicate and collaborate with others both within and outside the school to facilitate provision of the strategies and resources that are specified. The planning of successful learning experiences for students with special educational needs can be significantly enhanced by the contribution of parents. Parents can shed valuable light on their child's strengths, needs, learning differences, and learning styles, and they can play an active part in the development, implementation and review of their child's individual education plan. The Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs Act bestows a number of specific rights on parents in relation to their involvement in individual education plans for their children. This right is outlined by INCSE, has to be presented to each educational departments and offices of our country with detailed work guidelines to supervise or monitor the effectiveness of inclusive schooling in our country. Otherwise, the effort may get challenged even from the beginning itself. Looking in an inclusive classroom may look exactly like a regular education classroom, but there are some significant differences. Typically, the inclusion classroom has 2 teachers, a regular education teacher and a special education teacher who co-teaches. Some inclusion classrooms will have a regular education teacher and a special education assistant. The students consist of regular education students and special education students who are taught together. At times, the classroom will break into groups for small group instruction, and other times they are taught together. Students do not know which ones have an IEP and which ones do not. The teachers in the classroom help any student who needs help. The special education case manager ensures that the IEP is being followed and the special education students are meeting their goals. The inclusive classroom helps students with an IEP to be educated alongside non-disabled peers. This helps with socialization and ensuring higher standards. Students in the classroom have differentiated instruction. This means that students will learn at their level. Some students will have more academic responsibilities than others depending on unique needs. An inclusion classroom is not only good for students in special education. When implemented correctly, it is positive for everyone. Those students who struggle but do not qualify for special education services often do very well with the extra supports in place in this classroom. Students who are advanced learn to be more accepting and often offer assistance to others. A good teacher can offer material that is challenging for all students, while meeting the needs of those who learn differently. This is not accomplished by teaching all students the same, but by teaching at each child's level. I have nothing but respect for the teachers who can do this. While inclusion is a great place for many students, not all students learn best in this environment. There are students who need more individualized instruction at a much slower pace. There are students who do not do well with the stimuli in a regular classroom environment. It is important to consider all factors when determining the best environment for your child. Another option is inclusion for part of the day, and a special education classroom for certain classes. The aim is to be individual for each student, and his or her needs must be considered. Some schools embrace inclusion classrooms, while others have limited classrooms. Check to see what is available at your school. Unit Summary: the severity of the hearing loss and the age of onset of the loss are two important factors that influence individuals' abilities to communicate with others orally and learn through traditional instructional methods. School-age children with hearing impairments can be divided into two groups: the deaf and the hard of hearing. The deaf are also divided into two groups: those who are prelingually deaf, who typically lost their hearing at or before birth, and those who lost their hearing after they had acquired some language are called postlingually deaf. Educational programs for deaf students must behave special features. The students require intensive instruction to learn how to communicate with others effectively and to learn academic subjects. There are debates about the best mode of communication to use when educating deaf students. There are some developmental variations between children with hearing and children who lost their hearing ability. In conceptual performance, no difference has been found between hearing and deaf students. The available evidence suggests that the condition of deafness in no way poses no limitation on the cognitive capabilities of individuals. As far as academic achievement is concerned, factors as the severity of hearing loss, the age of its onset, parental learning condition, alternative communication means have significant effect for its positive/negative result. There are no much deviations in physical and motor characteristics of hearing impaired children from that of the normal hearing, unless other factors as attitudes of others, family, peers, teachers and the community as a whole, and the child's ability to use the alternative communication means are added. Hearing impairment by itself does not have direct either positive or negative impact on the social-emotional development of the child. Hence, careful identification, assessment, and intervention is the means to help persons with learning impairment entertain relative positive development. So, knowledge on these issues is important and necessary to work on hearing impairment. According to current knowledge, persons with visual impairments are divided into those who are with low vision and those who are blind. Visual impairment, directly or indirectly, affects the physical, motor, academic, social, psychological and communication development of an individual. The incidence of visual impairment increases with age. The older a person, the higher the likelihood of that person having some visual impairment. In order to implement timely intervention program for children with visual impairments, early intervention and assessment is essential. Currently, there are some adapted educational materials which can help students with visual impairment learn their education better. providing orientation and mobility training, listening skill training, braille training, and introducing some visual aids as enhanced image devices, audio aids. Optical character recuperation is very supportive to individuals with visual impairments. Become self-reliant. General unit assessment strategy. The following activity questions are helpful for the instructor in identifying learners' competence, whether they successfully achieve the learning outcomes stated for the unit. You can judge whether they properly respond to the following. Mention the possible communication and academic difficulties that children with sensory impairments could face. What is the psychological impact that children with hearing impairment face? Can you try to identify the strong and weak sides of each methods of communication for the hearing impaired? How do people in your community perceive visual impairment and react to persons with visual impairments? Explain the developmental effects of visual impairment on physical/motor, cognitive, academic, and psychosocial characteristics of a visually impaired child. Provide examples of educational materials and learning environments that accommodate students with visual impairments.